As you are all no doubt aware, the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, was founded on 1st February 1973. So, this is in fact its 50th year, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Maitreesh to deliver the R.C Dutt lecture here on this special year. I would like to tell you a little bit about the history of these lectures to start with, after which I've requested Professor Shoibal Kaur to introduce the speaker. So when the center began operations in 1973 at 10 Lake Terrace, it had been resolved that it would be fitting if 2 memorial lectures could be instituted and named after well-known Indian scholars. Subsequent to which, one in the name of Sakharam Ganesh Deuskar for lectures on Indian nationalism, later called the Deuskar Lectures on Indian History and Culture, and another in the name of Ramesh Chandra Dutt for lectures on political economy were set up. Ramesh Chandra Dutt, which is how he spelled his name, anglicized spelling, as you all again no doubt know already, served in the Indian civil services for almost 30 years during the second half of the 19th century. The exposure gained during his administrative work in India allowed Dutt to develop an understanding of issues such as land rights, famines, and lack of local representation. After retirement, he became involved in politics and was elected president of the Indian National Congress in 1899. He wrote extensively on the economic history of colonial India, condition of the peasants in Bengal, Bengali literature, and famines and land rights. His writings were instrumental in articulating and developing an initial understanding of the adverse economic impact of imperialism on colonies. In his introductory remarks to the first R.C Dutt lecture of 1975, Ashok Mitra had noted at the start the general purpose behind the institution of these lectures. I'm quoting, "Their purpose," Ashok Mitra said, "would be to present thoughts on aspects of life in contemporary India, where academic scrutiny of both the long range and the contemporary time dimension in international as well as national affairs was considered to be fruitful for summing up ongoing research, evoking interest in new areas of study, or presenting thoughts on the general features of life and conditions in our country." The papers presented under the R.C Dutt lecture series have maintained their focus on themes pertaining to the economic policies and development issues of the day. Over the years, some of the most eminent scholars and academics have delivered the R.C Dutt lectures at the center. These include Ashok Mitra, Deepak Nair, Kaushik Basu, Shunanda Sen, Devraj Rai, Bhuvijit Banerjee, Bhuvijit Patnaik, and C.T. Kurian, among many, many others. Reading out the entire list would take a long time. I will now hand over to Professor Shoibal Kaur to introduce the speaker for today.
Thank you, Chaudhary. It's indeed a great pleasure for me to in person introduce Professor Maitreesh Ghatak. It's exceptionally because he is a senior in school, Automobile, and we share a lot of common memories from the schools. Professor Ghatak is currently a professor of economics at the London School of Economics and an elected fellow of the British Academy. Before joining the LSE, he taught at the Department of Economics of the University of Chicago after completing his PhD at Harvard University with Professor Eric Lasky and Professor Abhijit Banerjee. His main areas of research interest are development economics, public economics, economics of organization, and issues relating to the Indian economy. He has been the director of the Development Economics Group at the Research Center Sticker at LSE since 2005. He is currently a co-editor of Economica, and I'm reading from his short bio because trying to explain his CV would actually take a whole class. So he's currently co-editor of Economica, has also served as the chief editor of the Journal of Development Economics for a substantial period of time. He has been the managing editor of Review of Economics, that is one of the topmost journals in the subject, in our subject of economics. And he has been also a co-editor of Economics of Transition. He's a research fellow of the Bureau for Research in Economic Analysis of Development, which is in short called BRADE, and the Center for Economic Policy Research, CEPR. These are all very well-known organizations involved in research on contemporary issues and policy issues as well. He has served as the lead academic of the International Growth Center, IGC, and has been a member of the research committee of the World Bank. He is a founding member of the several research networks, including trade, economics of social sector organizations, and non-profit governments and organizations, NGO. He's an essayist, writing in various English magazines, dailies, including Hindustan Times, Angubada Putrika. He's a very frequent writer in Angubada Putrika. He was educated in Padova School, as I said in the beginning, followed up by Presidency College, Delhi School of Economics, and Harvard University. Long time back, when I think about 10 to 12 years back, he was visiting Center for a conference, I believe, and we were thinking about who to invite for the next R.C Dutt lecture. It's always a thought process that goes on for the next speaker. And I proposed Maitreesh's name, and I was told that he's too young to be R.C Dutt lecture. And so it has to be a very sweet time between being too young or too old to be an R.C Dutt lecture. I think he's at the right time at the Center for R.C Dutt lecture. Welcome here. We are very pleased to have you again. We have about 1 hour, 1 or 15 minutes for the talk, and then we open up for questions. If you would kindly hold your questions for the end, we can moderate the questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Shweta, for the very generous and somewhat embarrassingly for me and long introduction, but thanks for that. It's a genuine pleasure to be back at the center. I first visited the center a long time ago. It was an upstarter building, and at that time there was a conference on agrarian economy of Bengal, where as a PhD student I presented my work with Abhijit Banerjee on Operation Korga. After that, I've visited the center many times. It's a genuine association I genuinely cherish. And also, it's an incredible honor to be invited to give this lecture. I think I have a few gray hairs now, so therefore, even though I would feel the suitable, trepidation to be standing and giving this lecture, hopefully that provides me with a little bit of buffer. So when it's interesting that Ramchandra Dutt, of course, is it's a very well-known name, but to me, interestingly, the association of his name, and he, of course, is a very eminent in so many different directions. But it's interesting that as a young kid, I was gifted a volume of his Bengali writings. And in particular, yesterday, in preparing for the talk, I dug up the volume that's still in my bedside bookshelf in Kolkata. And I have this, I don't know whether this can be seen, but this is my grandparents giving me this book in 1977. So I have to say that I have fond memories of reading that. And of course, it left an impression in terms of the classicalism of the language. And one of the interesting things also, I think, partly what was interviewed covered, but it was amusing to note that among his many distinguished roles, he was the first president of the Bombay Sahitya Parishad, with a certain Mr. R.N. Tagore being one of the vice presidents, and the other vice president was Novindranand Sen, the distinguished poet. With that out of the way, I would like to launch into the set of lectures I prepared for this series. So today I want to talk about this broad theme of what I'm referring to as growth of inequality and inequality of growth. And the idea, of course, is that what's happening to inequality, whether it's growing or declining, but also what's happening to the growth rates, and are these growth rates of different income groups, are they converging, are they diverging, and of course, these feed into each other. But that's the broad, sorry, I keep on doing the wrong thing, so the big but. So what I will try to do in these two lectures is to connect India's growth path of income with inequality, poverty, and labor market indicators. And it might seem like a disparate set of things, but hopefully in my lecture, I will try to provide some connecting threads around these issues. And in particular, I would say the sort of dominant theme, especially, I guess, the non-economists, is, what is this growth rate? Is it something we eat, we wear, we put on our head? What is it? How does it matter to the lives of the ordinary people? Because in the end, for us to care about the economy and the state of the economy, that has to be the primary social focus. So today I will focus just on this interaction between growth and inequality, and looking at the whole set of statistics relating, and trying to establish the growth of inequality and the inequality of growth aspect, and whether the underlying theme would be, has India's growth been inclusive? And more at a deeper level, what does it mean to have inclusive growth? Everybody going at the same rate, people's incomes converging to some level, or there being divergence. So these are some of the underlying kind of theoretical issues that will be lurking in what I say. In tomorrow's lecture, I will focus more specifically on poverty. I've been doing a fair bit of work on this, and also the state of the labor market. And they are, of course, related to the broad theme, because it's the microeconomics of what happens in the labor market, what's happening to poverty, that then feeds into the macro aspect of some of the things I will be talking about. So that's the plan for tomorrow. So today, my approach would be, given that this is a public lecture and I don't want to get too much into technical details, and we'll try to minimize jargon as much as I can. And what I would describe, what I'm trying to do here, would be in a way sort of groundwork for a deeper theoretical and empirical exploration into the notion of inclusive growth, and whether India's growth path has been inclusive, was ever inclusive, or has a chance of becoming inclusive. So, but for today's exercise, most of this will be certain trends and patterns and stylized facts that are established. I would not necessarily go into any rigorous analysis of cause and effect or theoretical mechanisms, even though I'll sketch some of the verbal arguments verbally. And it's also an attempt for the last decade or so. I've been writing quite a bit on various aspects of the Indian economy, which is runs parallel to my academic work or academic interest as a development economist. And therefore, there's a background to these explorations, which kind of stem from my work in development economics of the dynamics of inequality and poverty traps. But once again, this will be, more of a discussion of certain stylized facts and patterns, and as a background for a deeper theoretical and empirical examination. So with that introduction out of the way, I would basically give a very quick review of certain broad stylized facts relating to India's growth experience. And the data would be, I will stretch it as much as it is available. So for some of the series, the data goes back as early as the early 60s. The patchy data available on the 50s too, but then there are problems of comparability in putting them together. So for whatever I do, this will be the attempt. So therefore, it's also a chance for all of us to some of these facts may be well known, but it's also a chance to sort of take a broad overview as to what's going on. So first, kind of the growth pattern, okay? So this is just GDP per capita, okay? And once again, GDP per capita there are all kinds of tomes written on one. That's why that's not necessarily the best indicator of welfare, why it excludes public goods, public services, quality of life, rights, and all kinds of things. But we are going to focus on that as one of the preliminary indicators in terms of what's happening to the quality of life. And it is per capita, because the total, of course, is useful sometimes, but the total is also very misleading, because just to give a simple example, if you have an economy with 100 people, 10 of them experience a growth rate of 10%, 90% of them don't experience any growth at all, that economy GDP will show a growth of 10%. Because it's the total, right? So therefore it can be very misleading. And we will therefore, for most of the talk, will focus just on the per capita. So as we can see that it was, so it's been kind of flat until the 1990. After that, the climb started, okay? And this is the pandemic year. And this is really the very latest data that's available. So there's been a significant growth trend rate since the early 90s. Again, what I'm saying is reasonably well known, but this is just setting the stage. So if you look at the technical growth rate, so what I have here is literally the growth rate over a decade. So between 1960 and 1970, what was the total increase in GDP per capita? Okay, so that's the technical growth rate. If you divide by 10, you of course get the annualized one. So we can also see, therefore, it's useful to see that this was the period where the growth rates were relatively low. 80s is where the growth kind of started taking off, okay? And remember, in the earlier picture, it didn't look that steep, but if you're starting from a low base, even some climb in percentage terms start looking respectable, right? So that's really what's going on in the 80s. In the 90s, it went up, a bit more. The real sort of, high growth decade was 2000 to 2010, and this again averages out the 2008 financial crisis when there was a dip. And this has been the decade after that. So essentially, if you just want to put some numbers just to shape our overall assessment of what's going on. So from 1960, from which this data set starts, to 1990, GDP per capita increased in real terms by about 1.75 times. So which is to say it falls short of 2, twice, doubling, 1.75. But over 1990 to 2019, and you can why I chose 2019 and not 2020, because that was a pandemic era where there was a exogenously induced dip. It increased, 3.63 times. So that's clearly a big increase in the standard of living. But it's also something that I would like you to note here. So there has been a slowdown. It's a decadal number, so it's averaging out over the decades. But in general, there has been a growth slowdown that became apparent from 2016 onwards. Okay, so that is something that will be a point I will keep on coming back to. So if you want to look at this aspect a bit more, so here I've just looked at 2000 to 2021. Since I said there's been a growth sort of slowdown, this is trying to establish that a bit more carefully. Here I've just presented the quinquennial growth factors, and by growth factor I mean just the proportional multiple. So say the growth, whatever is the level of GDP per capita in 2005 as a ratio of what it was in 2000. So that multiple or that factor, you can see that just visually there's a steep climb over the 2005 to 2010 period, right? This was the UPA 1, and where the, generally speaking, for infrastructure boom or other things, the growth rates were high. After that, there has been a general decline, okay? And this become pretty clear in the last 5 years, okay? And this is averaging out again the dip due to the pandemic and then the rise, the recovery, and so on. So this is one kind of, most basic indicator that we would look at as to what's happening in the Indian economy in the long run. But that's just, in a way, very simple. Just a simple, one measure which may or may not be very, very descriptive. So this is sectoral distribution of output. Okay, so this is where we're trying to get to a bit more of a picture as to what's happening to the economy. And in particular, these curves represent just the proportion of total GDP of these different sectors. So that's the blue is agriculture, the orange is industry, and the gray one is services. So once again, these patterns are what we expect in the path of growth in most countries, where essentially countries evolve from primarily agricultural to primarily industrial and service-oriented economies. It's interesting if you look at the same thing, but this is employment as opposed to output. Yeah. What is striking here is if you compare these two, here agriculture share was more than 40% in 1961. Yeah. now it's less than 20%. So it has more than halved. But if you look at the employment though, there is a concomitant decrease, but it's still above 40%. It's somewhere in the mid 40s. So therefore, that immediately suggests that there is agriculture is where a lot of the action is what's happening to the bottom half in terms of income and standard of living. So this is just summarizing what this graph showed, that it basically immediately implies that on a per worker basis, the productivity is lowest in agriculture. If it's still employing nearly 50% of workers, but it's producing less than 20% of output, by definition, the remaining 50% of the population is engaged in sectors that are producing 80% or so of output. So therefore, it is to be kept in mind, and something that will come back tomorrow in more detail, as to what's happening both within the agricultural sector in terms of productivity, as well as what's happening in terms of workers moving to other sectors in terms of mobility from different sectors. Now, there are a couple of digressions which I set a test for myself, depending on how I do, I will engage in these digressions or not. So there are two digressions that I want to sort of mention before I move on to the main theme of it. So my self-imposed rule said that I should go a bit quickly over this, but just to mention. So there has been a lot of controversy over GDP. National accounting system has been overhauled in 2011-12, and there's been a lot of controversy where the comparability of the series before and after. I don't want to engage in the sort of technical details of that, which are involved and which people like Arvind Subramanian and others have written extensively about. But what we have to keep in mind, and therefore I've produced, this is the only figure that's taken from a secondary source, Nagaraj. Basically, it looks at this period, 2012-13 to 2019-20, and what is on the in the figure are growth rates, okay, not levels, but just growth rates. So it shows, according to the official statistics, this was an increase, going up to even 8.3. And you can see that this is quite high. Whereas if you use this alternative estimates that Subramanian and Sebastian Morris and others have done, it is going to be less. Okay. But having said that, it doesn't quite explain sustained growth, because these kind of changes of bases and indices could basically create a one-time thing, but that will die off, because as you go forward, you have to keep on inflating for this to boost the growth rates. But it has to be kept in mind in kept in mind to think about what happened in the last decade, which is for natural, political, and policy reasons we would be interested in. That we have to take whatever the official stats is saying with just that little bit of salt. Okay, this is digression number 2. Again talking about GDP and growth and things like that. So this was something I wrote recently in one of my newspaper essays in Anandabhajan Patrika. And what's interesting, what we provoked was this discussion about India's GDP ranking. So clearly, you could say that, look, all this focus, and I have heard it, sometimes to my face, but mostly on various online fora, as to this is all a very left-wing obsession about poverty and inequality. It's like, it's not something that, what is the India shining? That picture is also true. You cannot fool the whole world, with the interest that they show in the Indian economy. So all this kind of, sad theme music about, the bottom half are really struggling. Maybe we are barking up the wrong tree. So it was really more a reaction to this, but it has something useful and that fits into the broad narrative that what I have. That's why I indulged a bit in this sort of digression. So the digression is this: there is an interesting part. So if you look at GDP rank of India, it is true, it's number 5 right now, modulo the National Income Statistics Control Process. But if you take that on face value, it is number 5. In the early 90s, it was number 17 in the rank. So that's an improvement. I mean, we may not like the parts of this process. We may think that the rich has prospered more, whatever, but clearly there has been an improvement. But if you look at per capita income, it basically has stagnated. It was 161 in the early 90s. It's 159 at present. Now, this is very interesting. right? Why? Because we saw per capita income did go up. It's not like per capita income stayed flat and population was doing all the work in bumping up the number, scaling up the number. So therefore, there is an issue here, right? And that issue, in my view, actually speaks to the broad theme of what I want to present in today's lecture, which is, see, any country that increases per capita income deserves some credit. Something is happening. Something has changed in the economic engine, so that is happening. Maybe again, it may not be normative with the growth model we like or the development model we like, but something is really happening, right? Now think about a small country doubling its per capita income versus a large population-wise large country doubling its per capita income. The GDP boost factor will be larger the bigger your population is. So therefore, both India and China have benefited from the fact that there's undeniable credit to their economies that they have improved their per capita income, but it has not been fast enough. And starting with a low base, it hasn't gone far enough to change the ranking that much because the rest of the world is growing as well, and you're starting at relatively low bases. But the reason in GDP you start looking respectable and start looking like really one of the top five, these two are among the top five economies of the world, that has to do with the population multiplier. So you can almost think of this as reverse Malthus, right? Malthus is all about population will deflate whatever economic, status you have. This is a question that if you start improving, having a larger population immediately statistically implies that your overall GDP position would look better than your per capita income position. Now, admittedly, this is in the end kind of an accounting-like statement, because after all, per capita GDP is GDP divided by population, and therefore, this kind of, this as a simple formula connecting the two. But what's interesting though, and this is where I thought, why is the sort of, whether it's the G20 presidency, whether, the command, the respect that, India commands in various European and North American markets and so on. This has to do with the fact that, look, per capita income has gone up, but clearly not enough to improve the ranking. But it is basically a part of the economy that's bulging in terms of prosperity. And that bulge has a scale that's large enough to attract the attention of international capital as well as multinational corporations, because they go by scale. If a very small country suddenly becomes prosperous, it's okay, but it's still not that attractive compared to, say, and think about it, Britain or France's overall population is only 5 to 6% out of India. So therefore, even if it's a small fraction of the Indian population which is experiencing prosperity, that really explains why globally people are just not fooled by some accounting that GDP is just a total and that really doesn't capture anything. I think that left-wing critique kind of misses the point that, of course, in terms of quality of life, it's not saying much, but there's a reason that there is this overall interest in the Indian economy. But it would be, I would like to argue, for the wrong reasons, normatively. So now I want to go a bit into a theoretical backdrop as to how I want to connect the various themes that I mentioned at the very beginning. So think about, where is growth inclusive? So suppose there's an export sector that does well, say the software export, Infosys and others that were, taking off, and clearly there was a bump in India's kind of, foreign earnings and so on, and exports don't have to be. You can have technological innovation, whatever is the cause of a growth spurt. Yeah. The question is, think of this as a wave. If you didn't want to take a physical or geographic analogy, it's a wave. Now, the question is, will the wave last long and how high the wave will go? Or will it lead to subsequent rounds of waves that will essentially keep on creating some economic prosperity across? And these are, I've listed some, and I will not necessarily read them out, but basically what it happens, when say some sector is experiencing a growth due to technological change or market access, or for some reason demand shifts, what happens is, as the income of those factors of production that are engaged in those sectors, they grow, they will, unless they're importing everything they want, right? They will be spilling over some of their demand to the rest of the economy. And this is the key. To the extent the things that they demand are intensive in factors that are abandoned in that country, then you have a chance of the multiplier effect of the growth or the subsequent waves after the big wave to be more substantive and growth to be, more self-sustaining. Then suppose out of this software export boom, people were just buying European vacations. That's all they were doing. In that case, essentially the input into the rest of the economy's sort of economic cycles would be relatively limited. Now, there are many other channels, of course. I kind of, flipped through a bit about the supply side linkages, but this is just, again, the economist's way of accounting various, back and forth, because what is demand is also supply, because, if you supply something, you earn income, you spend on things, that's the kind of economic cycle. So there are other more specific things, migration, urbanization happens, right? When some of this, Bangalore is attracting, workers from Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Bengal, etc., right? And because of the ancillary industries and the informal sector. Also, firms increase investment and it's very demand growth. You would expect people to buy more cycles, more motorbikes, more cars, etc. And therefore, farms would, invest in their capacity to produce these things. Also, remittances would be another mechanism through which growth will transmit from, if people are in urban areas, they send their money back into rural areas. That would also cause these things to kind of, the virtuous cycle to be active. And also in the longer run savings and investment. As you have more prosperity, people will save more, they will invest, and that would be kind of the overall process. Now let's examine this frame in mind. What's going on in the state of demand as far as, Indian economy is concerned. And again, if you think about, maybe at a bit of a stretch to think of this as a detective story, but think about it, where is that growth coming from? What is that growth good for? That's the question, right? And it has to show up in other indicators, right? So that's the spirit of this exercise. So if you look at investment to GDP ratio, I just listed this as among the things that would create secondary cycles or waves of economic prosperity or economic activity. And then you can see that going about 2010 or so, this reached the peak. After that, this is as recent numbers as one can get. There's been a steep decline, and there's no amount of data massaging that can get away from this basic fact that there has been increase. And corporates are not NGO activists or leftists who are not kind of cooperating somehow. There's a reason, there's something that these numbers are telling us as to why they aren't looking forward to an expanding kind of source of demand for various consumer goods coming in the economy, as well as firms demanding various machines and other inputs and not investing in this capacity. So that's number one, exhibit number one. Exhibit number two, okay, what about Korea? What about Taiwan? What about China, right? I mean, there are, of course, other sources, domestic sector can, well, go to some stationary place. We will just rely on the international market, right? Look at, again, the numbers. This is the export growth, right? And what you see is a steep rise up to about 2030 or so. After that, there's some recovery recently. But if you compare the levels, it is basically no improvement in about 20 years. So once again, it is telling you something about what are the sources, where are the virtuous demand cycles coming from? Where are the tailwinds of demand kind of boosting other sectors coming from? This is just a simple composition of total expenditure into consumption, investment, and net exports. So it's really very basic national income. These kind of add up, that kind of exercise, right? Once again, what you can see is the net exports is showing negative growth really, because these are basically, the structure of aggregate demands. And so that basically means that you're basically importing more and exporting less. That's where, this is negative. And once again, here you do see a dip in investment, which we saw earlier, and consumer expenditure has been tapered at best. Okay, so this is kind of the picture from the overall kind of, looking at the national income. So essentially, the thesis that I'm going to put forward, and this is the distinguished tradition going back to, among others, LHP and Keynes, and that there has been a slackening demand problem. Of course, that's not the only component. There's productivity that matters. There are a bunch of other things. We don't have to be a demand side extremist to just focus on this. But clearly, it's one important piece of the economic cycle or economic chain of activity. So interestingly, despite all of this, and of course, we could think of this as, reflects a certain bias in terms of the criticism here. But look at list the government's policies. Just literally go to, I did that. I went to the various ministry things and just listed the number of programs that they have. And there are lots and lots of programs. I mean, this government is not short of creating lots and lots of, programs. This Yojana, that's Yojana, and that's all fine, right? I mean, UK did their own Yojanas too. But here, all of these are supply side measures, right? Essentially, the problem is you can pull by a string, but you cannot push by a string. If the demand side is not quite active, you can incentivize people, you can do this loan scheme, you can do that subsidy scheme, but unless there's some movement, people will just sit and wait and watch until things recover. So that's kind of the perspective I'll take. Now, this is kind of, again, I'm going through more specifically through what in India's case was. There was an exogenous growth spurt in infrastructure construction, software exports, segments of the manufacturing sector, such as pharmaceuticals and auto parts, that in the 2000s, the first decade and so, that experienced some growth, and that directly constituted only a small part of the labor force. If you think about the Bangalore techies or whatever, the relevant groups of people who benefited from it. Now, the problem is it was all good for a while, Bangalore, was a garden city with very little congestion, and now, well, I would say it's not. And clearly, therefore, it's a sign of success. It, of course, attracted people from different parts of the country and so on. But my argument, though, is because of the nature of the growth process and how the growth dividends were distributed, the gains from growth were distributed, this was bound to run out of steam, because if it's going to continue on steam, it would need a more sustainable basis of demand creation. And for that, you would need to bring in people who spend a greater fraction of their income in broad mass manufacturing goods, because that is where both the supply and the demand side would work in a kind of virtuous tandem, right? When it really goes to the very thin layer of the population, the demand for an existing industry does not grow that much. Yeah. Now, see what I'm saying here. I'm not saying that prosperity of a certain group that is benefiting for whatever reason is bad for normative reason. You may still think that that's not great, because you should have more egalitarian growth system. What I'm saying is that even by the logic of growth, and growth is what we're trying to maximize, this strategy has an inherent limitation. Okay, unless it's more broad-based, and that I genuinely think is the problem that we have. So when a software engineer experiences a substantial wage hike, she graduates from a two-wheeler to a car, but when the salary goes up more and more, it's not clear that this demand will percolate to things that would then employ local factors of production, maybe higher domestic help, you can go and patronize the arts or cottage industries or whatever. So the CMI data sets show that even after nearly 2 decades of high growth, 60% of India's consumer expenditure is on food and energy. That's pretty basic stuff, right? And for the bottom half of the population, this proportion is 70%. We are spending basically 70% of your income on these basic necessities. Yet, it is the poor who, when they increase in their incomes, have the largest chance of then upgrading their demand into more, buying a cycle, buying a scooter, buying a motorbike, and things like that, right? And that is really the problem. The richer the household, the higher is the saving rate, right? And clearly, that is going to put a limit on how much they can spend on luxury vacations, the fourth car, luxury, flat in some fancy place and so on. And indeed, the expenditure elasticities for the richer consumers are lower than the bottom 50%. Again, it's a jargon. All it says is that when they experience the same percentage of increase, say 10% increase in income, the rich plow back much less of that into the economy in terms of demand. That would then create subsequent rounds of indirect or induced demand on other goods and factors of production. So essentially, the bottom five, and also not just that, the kind of things that the rich buy, and here I've listed some, are appliances and EMIs, recreation, restaurants, bills and rent and education. Here, it is difficult to imagine a lot of that would percolate into things that would employ unskilled laborer at a large scale, right? Whereas if you look at, the poor, the bottom five rural deciles have far greater expenditure elasticities on all foods, clothing, intoxicants, cosmetics, transport, etc., etc. I was talking to a very well-known corporate leader. I mean, I don't talk to such people very regularly, so this was a chance encounter. And he was telling me, and it's also recorded in some public, domain, the fast-moving consumer goods. He said there has been an absolute deceleration in its increase, and these are things like shampoos and oil and things so that the poor would buy, and that would basically have a big scale advantage because when firms produce it, so apparently that has completely flattened out. So I now want to come to the crux of today's talk. So let me just see how am I doing in terms of time. Oh, there's a there too. So I think I'm doing all right, right? Okay. So I want to therefore talk about what's really happening to inequality, in particular how the poor are doing, because my implicit thesis is a large part of the population is not really benefiting much from the group. It's not to say they are not benefited at all, but its improvement has been made. As a result, what we're going to see is therefore they cannot spend for the reasons I just described and contribute further to the growth process. And that kind of creates a vicious cycle that growth of inequality and inequality of growth would go hand in hand. So therefore, parts of the economy will reach European levels, have already reached it. Indian billionaires, they are showing up in all kinds of top 10, top 20 Forbes lists and so on. And not all of that is necessarily due to at least direct nefarious means. It's just sort of a very narrow segmented growth process which has led to this prosperity. So, and this is where I have listed that our basic hypothesis is going to be that high inequality leads to slack domestic demand, and that is an inherent kind of break in the growth process. It's not to say growth cannot happen. You can have some trade boom going on, although given the protectionist policies of the current government, that doesn't look likely. And this I can quote some very pro-free trade people like Arvind Panagari and others who have said basically the same thing, right? This is not going to be happening there. Also, given my general assessment of the policy thrust of this government, other than the supply side focus, it's also highly regulated. So it's interesting. If you think about Reagan and Thatcher, they, again, I can only imagine what was in their hearts, but at least in their policies, their spirit was to deregulate, and they were not stopping somebody from setting up a business. Their problem was the poor are not taking enough advantage of it, and welfare systems are not good, and so on. But they were not trying to over-regulate. If anything, they were trying to push back, and there were legitimate grounds coming from the left to be concerned about that, because some regulation is clearly needed, whatever is your overall political or policy view. But this is also a highly regulated environment. I was talking over coffee today, and even academic institutions face lots of regulations. The point is, all the supply siders, the US style supply siders, would kind of immediately say that that can't be very good for growth either, right? So therefore, this is kind of a combination of increasing inequality that leads to stagnation via Keynes, Alichki type factors that the left often emphasize. But there's also an overregulation, excessive focus on interventionist policies that is also not going to be particularly stimulating from the growth point. Okay, so now I want to show you some figures on long-run inequality trends. So this is perhaps some of it is maybe known, but compared to some of the other broad macro stats I showed, hopefully there'll be more to chew on here. So here, let me just describe what's in here. This is income inequality from 1950 to 2021. And this is all taken from Piketty and his colleagues, their World Inequality Database, which I highly recommend. If you just want to look at these numbers, you can just download the relevant series for India and other countries. One can question, one can debate, and I have written some on some of the data issues relating to that. But still, it is the best we have. So here what we have is the income share of the top 10%, that's the orange one. The income share of the top 1%, that's the blue one. And the yellow one is the income share of the bottom 50%. Okay, so let's just stare at this rather than me flashing through lots of figures very quickly. Let's just stare at this diagram or figure for a second. So we can see that even in 1950, in terms of levels, the top 10% was cornering about 1/3 of national income. Yeah. The bottom 50% just about had 20%, which is nothing to write home about in terms of an egalitarian pattern, but that's what it was. And the top 1% had about 12, a bit more than 10%. That was their share of national income. It was reasonably flat with some decrease happening in the 70s and 80s. You could say that this was Indira Gandhi and our, fight on certain on industry or certain businesses, etc. Could be that. But interestingly, starting about in the mid 80s, when Rajiv Gandhi turned a more pro-business policy focus, things started turning around, and that is perfectly correlated with the timing of when the growth rate of per capita income started picking up, right? You can see this, right? So now the share of the top 10% has reached close to 60%. That is an alarming number. Whatever is your overall view about what ideal income distribution should be, that is a disturbing number where 90% of the population earn basically that 40% or so, and 10% are earning nearly 60%. And you can see that the patterns are such that now the top 1% has comfortably beaten the bottom 50%, right? So their share is about now more than 20%, and this is now the current share of the bottom 50%. This is how, I wouldn't say this is how the other half lives, but this is exactly what fraction of income they command in terms of their overall earnings from the economy. This is subject to all kinds of data limitations. We all know that in the end, these inferences are based on data, and any kind of data requires certain assumptions to make things comparable. This is the chart, the same thing I've done, but for wealth inequality. Yeah. One of the things I should point out, and I have written an article in the India forum on this inequality aspect, wealth inequality always tends to be more than income inequality. And income inequality always tends to be more than consumption inequality or expenditure inequality. And the logic is simple. Wealth inequality accumulates. You're inheriting, you're putting stuff in your bank account that's accumulating. Yeah. Income is your earnings. So therefore, the chance of inequality is a bit less than what would be the case for wealth and analogously for consumption. So once again, not to harp on the theme of gloom and doom here, but we can see that there has been kind of a slow decline. Again, wealth moves slow also. Okay, so but we can see that there is certainly some decline in the share of the bottom 50%, which is now less than 10%, and clear increase in the share of the top 1%, and definitely the top 10% share of wealth is more than 60%, right? Which was for income, it was a bit less. Here is more than that. Okay. Now, this is more a digression figure, so I can summarize it without you spending your scarce attention capital on this. This is just to show that whatever I've shown with the World Inequality Database, one of my co-author, Rishad Kumar, my joint work with him present tomorrow. He has a paper with Ishan Anand, basically combining the World Inequality Database with Forbes types list and kind of simulating what happens to the very top. because the very top would not be captured by the sample surveys that capture wealth inequality or consumer inequality. So we all know that, when was the last time any of us filled in either the NSS, Consumer Expenditure Survey, or the AD survey, which is the All India Data and Investment Survey, etc. So if you combine that, according to Anand and Kumar, the top 1% share is even more. That's the only kind of extra point from that. You could say, hey, this is tough, right? I mean, maybe what's happening in India is happening everywhere. So let's not, bemoan or knock down the India shining star. The thing, though, is that if you look at, say, 2012 and 2018, I have selected some countries, but the WID database allows you to do among any countries that you want. So therefore, there's no chance of really selectively presenting them. You can take any countries and do these comparisons. Clearly, something is happening with Russia and India, yeah. And I can tell you it's not reported here. South Africa and Brazil are other countries where clearly something is happening in terms of the top 1% wealth share. There are, of course, other more subjective or qualitative evidence that would support it too, but this is in a way hard data in terms of the wealth distribution. Now, this would be more a segue to tomorrow's talk. But if you now look at the other side again, we already looked at their share of income and share of wealth. If you look at this vulnerable employment, which is something that the ILO presents, it's basically casual labor and forms of self-employment, which are by construction something that you don't have a guaranteed income. So if you look at the share of that, that remains around 50%, right? So that is, again, not surprising given some of the numbers you already saw, but this is literally how the other half of India, and this is, it's not entirely up to date given sort of the data that were available, and this is the measure of undernourished as percentage of the population. Okay, again, some of this you may have seen, and I'm not saying that this is, the first time people are staring at these numbers, but my attempt here has been to put together an overall picture and try to see what could be the underlying kind of dynamics there. That's really the goal. So now I want to, really trying to wrap up this section. I want to present something that I have worked with my student, Lin Chuan Shu, where basically we have come up with a simple method of calculating growth rates by income percentile. So you give me a growth rate that happened over a certain period, yeah? And you give me the World Inequality database, because it tells me what is the share of income of different groups over time. And combining the two, you can back out the group-specific growth rates. What was the growth rate of the average growth rate per capita GDP stuff that we saw? The top 10%, top 1%, etc. Right? So this has to do with the inequality of growth aspect of the broad theme that I pointed out. We saw the growth of inequality, and now I want to present some numbers for the inequality of growth. Okay. So let me just first, because I'm going to show you a fair number of figures. So let me give you a broad summary, and then we can stare at some of those figures a bit more carefully. So in most of the time periods, and you will see that the time periods typically stretch, given the comparability of data, we cannot span the whole period from the 1960s to the recent times. And part of the reason why this data is truncated here is basically because the way the World Inequality database calculates its income share of different groups is using the NSS survey, expenditure survey. You extrapolate income from expenditure, and the NSS survey has not been published. If it were published, the 2017-18 one, these numbers would be extended a bit to the more to the right. Okay, but we got what's available from the data set. Okay, so that's the kind of time period we have. In most of these time periods, the top 1% experience the highest growth rates compared to the other groups. Now, you may say that, okay, isn't what you would expect? I would say every textbook of development economics, except for chapters on poverty traps, a little bit of self-advertisement there, because that's one of the things that I kind of work on using more micro data. would typically imply that the richer you are, your growth rates taper off because, essentially you can have a boost for a certain stretch, but after that it taper off. And it is the, when you're not poor, but when you're kind of at the lower middle, that is where your growth rate should be. And largely for the base effect. How hard is it to increase your income from 10,000 to 15,000 rupees a month, right? And how hard is it to increase it from say 2 lakhs to 3 lakhs? So that's the kind of logic that so at some point there is some diminishing returns that take. That's clearly not the case in the data. Yeah, and I'm going to show you some numbers. So therefore, what we have is a dynamic that the initial level of inequalities were big, and after that, rather than convergence, which is what most of mainstream kind of growth and development economics focuses on, right? It's actually divergence. It's actually they're also the richer growing faster. So there is increasing polarization of incomes. Now, many of these ideas go back a long time. What we have now is the advantage of these big data sets that allow us to kind of look at these things and quantify and establish them more rigorously. So the bottom 50% and the middle 40% witnessed very similar growth rates, which were below the average growth rate. And the relative economic status of the bottom 90% has not changed much. Okay, so let's look at some of these numbers. So this in a way is the most stark one. So I have put from 1994 up to 2014, these are growth rates I calculated for a specific income deciles or percentages, right? So just to give an example, what this is showing, the gray curve is the top 1% growth rate, and this black one is the bottom 50%. And you can see that the richest growth rate in the top 1% often is busting even the 12% barrier there, right? That's how it is gone. Whereas the bit poor, except for that, one sort of short interval between 99 and 2004, where we see this growth rate that's just about 8%, it is definitely less. Okay, so not only they have lower levels of income, the base effect is not helping them, which is what would be the common sort of premise, because we are talking about percentage growth here. We are not talking about people taking over and beating somebody in their position in the income distribution. We're just saying how fast we grow. So can you bridge the gap? Clearly, that's not happening. I now do variations of this. So to the extent you want to not necessarily stare hard at the numbers, this earlier graph kind of does the main job. That's the headline kind of graph that shows the gap between the top 1 and the bottom 50%. So if you look at this graph, this one has the average growth and that of the top 1%. The average growth is what we saw at the very beginning of the talk. This is what gets reported in newspapers, and India doing well, India's growth rate is among the highest rates in the world, that kind of discussion. That's your average growth rate, okay? And again, there we have to keep in mind what the total GDP rate per capita, national income accounting controversies, but leaving that aside. So this is again fairly sort of surprising in terms of the size of the gaps that is seen for most of this period. This is the top 10% versus the average. Okay, once again, the curves are distinctly on top of each other. Okay, this is the middle 40%, which is now the orange one, yeah, versus the average. So it is lying basically strictly below. Yeah, and this is the bottom 50% versus the average. Yeah, so one question you could ask is, once again, is this specific to India? Life is not fair. The economic domain is particularly not fair. Yeah, so maybe this is a common pattern, and Kuznets's kind of optimistic view that after a certain growth spurt or growth process, eventually, inequality sort of initially goes up. After that, it starts coming down. All of the numbers I showed you are not kind of consistent with that more optimistic view. And indeed, Piketty and his colleagues deserve credit for sort of creating this database and documenting some of these factors. So I have picked up our So the China as a comparison country, but once again, you could pick other countries and do this exercise because that's the advantage of having this publicly accessible data sets. So doing this, we really found something very interesting. Okay, I mean, again, maybe not surprising, but it's as a researcher, you're always looking to find something that would perhaps, validate what your hypothesis is, or completely go against it so that you scratch your head and you start afresh that I'm not barking up the right tree. So basically, let me give away the punchline. China really grew much faster, and I'm going to show you a graph, and it is not something that would surprise you. China generally grew faster than India. But if you do the same exercise that we did by income groups, yeah, in the top, there's not that much difference. So when we saw that, we said, okay, this is happening in China as well. It's the middle 40 and the bottom 50 where the gap is extremely clear, so that we showed it. So this is just the decadal growth in per capita GDP, India versus China. I only put this here so that we keep in mind that China grew faster. So we have a visual depiction of until about the 90s, the blue is the India bar and the orange is the China bar. You can see that starting 2000, which was a good decade for India, China did much better, and it has been the case since the 90s. That's the general pattern. But this is the one that I wanted to draw your attention to. So here, we just did the annualized growth rates by income group, 94 to 2014. Again, it's a shorter time period because of data limitations. So what we have is the average for this period. And of course, China beats India. Yeah. But if you look at the top 1%, again, in China, a bit more. Yeah. But if you look at the middle 40% and the bottom 50%, that's where the gaps are really big. So therefore, there is something going on in India, which basically the benefits of growth, because I think often, at least in some quarters of the left, there's almost one could have legitimate environmental and other concerns about unregulated growth process. I'm not entering that, and that's a good debate to have. But in general, though, that growth is generally a good thing if you have more income and better standard of living. But normatively, that only makes sense if it is shared broadly in the population. That's where you can have an ethical justification that this growth process is basically lifting the poor from poverty, etc. This is really something that we have to keep in mind in celebrating India's growth process, which there's no reason we shouldn't celebrate, because it is better to grow, not to grow. But the pattern of growth process that we have seen clearly has benefited the top, and this benefits have not. But it's not like the middle or the poor have not benefited. So this is some of the earlier debates that poverty didn't even decline after liberalization, which empirically happens not to be correct. It did decline. The question is how much, is it sufficient? And that is kind of the right question to ask. Okay, I'm nearly done. So I will just then provide some summing up, and then of course I'll be happy to answer questions and thoughts you have. So I want to now go back to thinking again a bit conceptually about how do I put all of this together. So clearly, there are two pieces of this growth engine that are important. One is, how is the income spent? Who's getting the income and how are they spending? That's clearly one side of the piece of the story. And the other is, out of this expenditure pattern, whose factor demands are generated, labor, capital, land, other things. And then, of course, we can do round two, that out of their demand, what's happening to the demand for other factors of production. So that's the broad sort of two pieces to keep in mind. So I want to go back to the earlier sort of more conceptual discussion. Suppose by some miraculous discovery of some I don't know, natural resource, although one hesitates to say that given the economy environment, but suppose there's something that drops from the sky for free, right? And suppose with that revenue, we can, essentially have a transfer program that would be directed at say, the bottom 50% of the population. Just a pure exogenous income increase. Suppose that to be possible. Given the figures we have for their propensity to spend, which is economists' jargon way of saying what percentage of their income they spend versus what they save, right? And the types of things that they spend for, that would essentially create a more labor demand, induced labor demand, which would then again have rounds of expansion in terms of demands for other sectors. And also if you sort of step out of the model, economist sort of models and statistical way of looking at things. That's the story, whether it's, Potter Pachali or any other thing, of people moving from villages to cities in the search of a better life, for jobs. And this is how, economic development, economic growth are very abstract concepts. In the end, I often, this is just a, a side remark. Often when businesses complain about wage costs going up, I always, smile and think that's the only way economic development is reaching the poor. If the wage costs are going up, that's good, because that's the only benefit from the growth process they're going to see, right? I remember, when after the left run, some of the rural reforms that happened, there was widespread complaint in the Bengali middle classes that domestic services have become very expensive, right? And fair enough, that's correct from one point of view. But another point of view, that's a sign of some progress in the status of living in certain parts of the population. And what I pointed out was just the ethical consideration given some of the poverty related discussions we'll have tomorrow, that it's not just beneficial from just the ethical point of view, that it is given how stingy, how miserly our poverty lines are, it is really a crime to allow people to live below that. So when we say, oh, poverty is down, it's okay, maybe 20% or whatever is the relevant percentage. It's not the kind of people you would see even who would look visibly poor in the streets of the city. These are people who are really struggling and so on. But I'm also giving a pragmatic argument here. If by some way you can tweak this engine, so that these groups have more purchasing power, they'll spend a bigger fraction of it, and the demand pattern that would create for other factors of production would allow these waves to reach other parts of the economy. So even if you were a businessman, like the person I was talking to, who is concerned about the flattening out of the rural, fast-moving consumer goods demand thing, that person got it. And he said that, look, what you're saying in terms of the theory actually makes sense to me. So essentially, income distribution would drive this demand pattern that affect the demand for pattern. I'm repeating myself. And the interplay of these two forces is what conceptually I'm working on now, stepping out of the exercise I did for today's lecture in terms of a more theoretical framework, where essentially would economies segment into enclaves where the rich largely are dealing with people who are not necessarily equally rich, but it's segregating into distinct segments, right? If you think of one of my favorite analogies is that of a train, and going back to an engine of growth kind of thing. So suppose there's a train with an engine, that's the engine of growth. And for whatever button that Manmohan Singh or others press, that engine starts, moving, it's moving faster. The question is, if the economy is segmented in these compartments, what is the linkage from compartment to compartment that will allow the whole train to move? Or are there certain compartments, in this case, more than 50% of the population, which are not moving much at all because the linkages are weak through supply and demand? And Nebraj Rai has this nice description of what I just discussed, that essentially he connects it to the Lewis dual economy type thing. He had rural, urban, traditional, modern sector in mind. But we can sort of borrow the terminology and think of the dual economy also as this enclave economy of shopping malls and bright and shining India, and the other parts of the economy which are not part of this virtuous pulls and pushes of supply and demand. And I will not sort of read out the quote. Essentially, is this segregation something we empirically can document? I have only given suggestive evidence that it could be going on, but rigorously establishing this would require a lot more careful work, and that is something that I'm working on, and I'm sure others are interested in this as well. Indeed, now let's just wrap up. I mean, I'm literally down to my last few slides. This kind of goes back to this evidence about fast-moving consumer goods and other things that Vivek Kaul has this 2023 essay where he produces some statistics that document, this slowdown of certain segments of market demand, which typically come from the rural areas and the poorer sections. In fact, Vivek and I were discussing whether one could, these data sets are not, they're price evaluated. So you can get the fast-moving consumer goods database, but it's not that easily accessible compared to the other data. But you could do something like plane travel expenditure versus airline. It will not be comprehensive. It will be just one indicator. But there are ways to get at, are there way I can back up the demand side story more? And these are some of the things that in our ongoing work, we are exploring ways to do it. But I would still say, if you go by circumstantial evidence, as in legal sort of terms, I think the circumstantial evidence is pretty strong that something is wrong on the demand side. It doesn't mean that's the only thing that's wrong, but something is clearly gotten a bit wobbly and stagnant on the demand side, and that's disproportionately in the bottom 50% of the population. And these are all connected to rising inequality and the inequality of growth rates, etc. Yeah. So essentially, there are some other points here about the demand for NREGA still being pretty high, even though often payments are not regular or done in a systematic way. And once again, if the economy is booming, if post-pandemic we are back to our growth path, why should there be so much demand for NREGA? Well, is it a support programs, 100 days of guaranteed stuff? If you have better options, you should not have to take this up, right? And tomorrow I'll talk more about the labor market. And that is where I want to conclude today's talk, that essentially, let me not repeat myself by giving you big picture view of the macroeconomic aspects in which inequality has grown over time. Growth rates by income percentiles show tendencies that would tend to imply greater segregation or greater polarization of income. And there is no smoking gun, but all the circumstantial evidence suggests something